by the way, as it was in the advertisements and on NPR. But Caleb Steffen gave this talk, as far as I know, the first time last year here. I guess he'd given it some other places, but in January last year, and we were impressed with it and asked him to come back and do this talk again. We're really happy to see some folks in the audience that are not typically here at Grandrounds. Inspector Stone back there from the police department, you're welcome to come anytime, sir, and we're glad you're here today. And Mr. Henry Haas coming in there, which y'all need to know serves us well on the Board of Trustees of Erlanger, and we appreciate what that group of people does for free with a lot of labor and presumably a lot of love along the way on our behalf. For those of you that don't know Dr. Steffen, he was a military brat and traveled around the world a lot, but did his medical education out in Missouri and then his surgery residency in Nebraska, where we had several friends in common, and then came here for plastic surgery, and of course in finishing up in June and going to be leaving us, so we wanted to catch him before he got away to do this encore presentation. Along the way, he's made a lot of poster presentations and several publications. Has made the plastic surgery department and our institution look good, and we appreciate you for that. I think that we wanted this topic here today. Obviously, anybody who reads the paper or follows the news on the internet or TV, issues about violence, and particularly among young people, is really very, very disturbing. And anything any of us can do to help staunch that, we want to do. So, Caleb, we look forward to this talk again. I do want to mention he actually followed through after last year, went to the Tennessee Medical Association meeting as a delegate and got passed a resolution by the TMA that you can, I guess, will tell us something about along the way, what the details of that are. So, Caleb, got the floor.
Thank you, Dr. Burns and Department of Surgery. It's a pleasure to be here to talk to you about media violence, children, rampage shootings again. I have no financial disclosures or conflicts of interest. Is it working? Can you all hear me okay in the back? Okay, great. So we'll talk about the problem of media violence and some historical perspective for it. We'll talk about some answers for critics of this, as this is a sometimes hotly debated topic, and then perhaps some ways that we can help in our communities and our homes. This, I used this in this talk before Donald Trump ever used it for his montage. So this is a level from a first-person shooter, which I've personally played, called Call of Duty Modern Warfare 2. I showed this last time. I usually just start out with this because it kind of gives some perspective to what children are doing for enjoyment. You're a deep cover operative in with some other Russian terrorists, and then you come to an airport. And of course, you and a first-person shooter get to hold the game. That's your perspective. And then for the next 20 minutes or so, you murder terrorists, you murder innocent civilians and police persons in that level for the game. The problem is not just with rampage shootings, but it's a concern for all of us, as adolescent suicide accounts for 20% of deaths in adolescents and young people. It's rising. Homicide is the leading cause of death for young people. Threats of massive violence are increasing besides just rampage shootings in general. And of course, there's high numbers of prevented and unreported events. And show you some stats about the rising of rampage shootings and mass murder. And violent crime, which has previously been down, seems to be rising again. So then the obvious question is, why is this happening now? We had a recent Florida school shooting. We have the serial bomber in Austin. We have a 9-year-old yesterday who shoots his sister in the back of the head over a fight over a video game controller. And then we have another school shooting in Maryland where a gunman brings a gun to school and then is killed by a law enforcement officer after they exchange gunfire. So these are statistics from 1980 on the number of mass shootings in the United States. Here is world terrorism data. Here's 1980 for parallel, also rising. So we have rising terrorism, rising rampage shootings. Rampage shootings in general are kind of a new kind of killing. There's not necessarily a specific target. We've seen more of them, obviously, in the last 3 decades. The perpetrator is doing something more theatrical than just revenge for some sort of interpersonal conflict or some sort of social effort. Is there a common link between terrorism and these? I think perhaps there is. You'll hear different terms thrown around when you read about this in the media: mass murder, mass killing and shooting, which is the murder of large numbers of people simultaneously. Historically, that number has been 4. They've changed it recently to 3, I think, but probably a lot of people will still use 4. A rampage shooter, which is what we think of a lot of times in school shooting events, is someone who's actively engaged or attempting to kill people in a populated area. We're not talking about serial killers. Serial killers is something completely different than this. Separate events, a cooling off period between those. So we won't be talking about that. So prior to the 1970s, we didn't really have mass school shootings. There was certainly mass murder before that, and this was largely perpetrated by adults. The idea that children and adolescents now perpetrate these things regularly is a novel occurrence. You are familiar with Columbine. There's the child who murdered his family after they took his Halo game away. Of course, Sandy Hook. A rampage in Santa Monica where someone was pretending they were part of the Grand Theft Auto game in real life. Our event in Chattanooga in 2015, the Pulse nightclub, Parkland, and many more. For most of these, they've been reviewed, and these perpetrators have an excessive interest in media violence, particularly since the 1990s, and some part of the 80s. Doom, Mortal Kombat, Grand Theft Auto, Halo 3, Counter-Strike, Call of Duty, and many more were mainstays of their activities when they weren't sleeping. Adolescent killers, there's been multiple profiles that are done, but they're typically Caucasian males, reasonably healthy and smart, but they have a low self-esteem. They're from a family that might be intact but deeply dysfunctional. Guns are available to the family, and at least in this profile, 100% of these killers had an interest in media violence. They often specifically identify with the game avatars themselves, and the perpetrators of the Columbine shooting certainly wrote about that, and they're motivated by vengeance against society, no one in particular necessarily, power and status. They typically keep track of who has these things are not done on a whim. They're planned over the course of weeks and months and years, and then they keep track of other people who have done these things, and it's a body count, and they do it as a comparison. And so all this media coverage is very exciting for them. So this is not me. I always say that just to clarify. This is from the video game Hitman, just to illustrate kind of the point of identification with avatars. In my wife's hometown, in Jefferson City, Missouri, a pretty nice area. One of her brother's friends from high school, she knew both of these young men, became friends, but they were kind of the loner, kind of ostracized. One of them really liked to play this game. And in fact, this was his Facebook profile background picture. He became paranoid that his friend that they got involved with after they'd done some petty theft and other things was going to rat him out to the police. So under the guise of taking him shooting, he stands behind him and shoots him in the back of the head, and he dies, and then he dismembers his body, burns it in a 50-gallon drum, exactly as this hitman does in the video game to dispose of bodies after you get rid of them. And of course, he was eventually led the police to the body after they found what he had done. That was his way to bring that into a reality. So this is my way to think about this. Obviously, video games are very popular, violent movies are very popular, and not every one of people who participate in those things becomes a bad citizen or a rampage shooter, certainly not. So we have to think of what's happening with these people. So this is my way of thinking about it anyway, is sometimes circumstances get to be very difficult for people, and the things they use to support themselves in those difficult circumstances are their relationships with others, also how they see the world, is it a good or a bad place, and also the unseen elements of a person like their overall psychiatric wellness, emotions, etc. But sometimes people don't have those pillars of support to help them with difficult circumstances, and their world falls apart. And sometimes that can be put back together. You know, relationships are disrupted, misdemeanors, etc. But sometimes something more serious occurs, and the individual is obviously crushed under the weight of those circumstances, either with something that's going to land them with life in prison, or commitment for suicide or other problems like that, or key relationships are never going to be repaired. Obviously, an even smaller subset of our population, basically these are people who are feeling hopeless, find this option unacceptable, and so they want to take other people out with them. And I think that's kind of the paradigm of how people get from being just a regular citizen to a rampage shooter. So now we'll talk a little bit about the story or history of media violence, since that's probably unfamiliar to at least the few of you here who haven't seen this talk before. It's a cycle that's been going on since the 50s of tragedy. It's spurring on additional research and then additional debate about whether or not the perpetrator's interest in media violence had anything to do with their violent behavior, denial that there is any relationship, further tragedy, and the cycle continues. In 1965, amidst the smoking controversy, Dr. Hill presented his criteria for causality. Relationships need to be related in time between the two variables. They need to be reproducible. They need to have a strong association and a specific association, and there needs to be a coherent explanation for why the two are related. And you'll find that the body of work, though there are conflicting studies for this, the body of work for this is in fact related, such that some of the violence that we see in society can be accounted for in a causative fashion as related to media violence. But obviously what folks who are saying that are not saying that every person who plays violent video games or watches violent movies is going to become a perpetrator. We're simply speaking as to society as a whole. Some at-risk individuals will take their interest in media violence to extremes. So in the 50s and 60s, TV household ownership increased to 90%, from obviously zero at the advent of television. And hearings in 1952 concluded that media violence is probably harmful for children. And then in '69, the National Commission on Causes and Prevention of Violence found that TV violence was an important contributor to real-world violence. In the 70s, the Surgeon General reported a causal relationship. The American Medical Association resolved that TV violence is a risk factor and harming children and potentially our future society, and they opposed programs with violence. In the 70s, I think one of the best ways to look at this is if you don't have the variable present, what are things like after you introduce that? And in a No Television Canada, they studied the introduction of TV prospectively, and they found that aggression was increased by 160% in 2 years. If you were going to see the long-term effects of that, you would obviously have to follow those same children over the next decade to see if those established scripts that they learn from television during its introduction, how that pans out in adulthood to see real-world violence typically. So over 1,500 males in '78 were evaluated for their quantity and quality of media violence exposure over time, and they controlled for a lot of factors, and they were 50% more likely to commit serious violent acts if they had above average rates of exposure. In the 80s, this large study, and with medical societies involved as well, found a strong link between TV and real-world violence. Children's programming that they studied remained very violent, and they found that it was as strongly correlated as any other variable that has been measured. In response to consistent concerns about this, the TV Violence Act was made in the 1990s, which was largely ignored. Advisory boards were also made, and a rating system for video games. None of these really had the desired effect, and in spite of these being done in the early 90s, serious TV violence continued to increase dramatically during that time. This is kind of a humorous slide that I thought was particularly funny when I was in college about Rambo, with different statistics from '82 to 2008. So the number of people killed increases from 1 to 236, and people per minute, obviously, corollary to that. And then also an element of harmful media violence is having a consequenceless world on that, and the number of people that he shoots out without significant harm to him increases as well. Obviously, he doesn't take his shirt off as much for the last one. In 1992, a researcher, Centerwall, who'd done an excellent analysis of the introduction of television into matched controls in South Africa, Canada, and the United States, comparing violence, and using this study, which obviously would have potential areas for criticism, but nonetheless it was as well done as could be done. And his conclusion was that if hypothetically television technology had not been developed, there would be, in the United States, there would be 10,000 fewer murders, 70,000 fewer rapes, and 700,000 fewer assaults. In 2000, the major medical societies came around for a joint statement establishing a causal connection between media violence and aggressive behavior in some children. The conclusion was that viewing entertainment violence leads to increase in aggressive attitudes, values, and behavior, particularly in children. The reason they usually focus on aggression rather than violence is because that's difficult to measure over time, and you need decades of additional research to see how that person is going to turn out as an adult. In 2000, the Surgeon General concludes again that violence leads to increased aggression. The California Supreme Court decides to create a civil fine up to $1,000 for selling and renting violent video games to minors. Another longitudinal study found that watching greater than 7 hours of TV as an adolescent led to an increased likelihood of aggressive behavior to others later in life. A randomized control trial of TV reduction versus controls. This is kind of the opposite of the no-tell studies. I think this is also telling of having two groups of children. One children has the curriculum where they reduce the amount of TV and, of course, the amount of associated violence that they intake, compared to one that does not, and that leads to statistically significant peer-rated and verbal aggression scores. So there's multiple meta-analyses looking at the conclusions that have been done for violent media and the positive relationship between exposure and aggressive feelings, thoughts, and behavior, and physiologic changes is essentially equivalent in magnitude to asbestos exposure and cancer, calcium intake, and bone mass. Unfortunately, in 2011, the Entertainment Merchants Association, a $35 billion industry, was able to overpower the state of California in arguments at the Supreme Court level about their law and civil fine for selling video games to minors. So the Supreme Court ruled that law unconstitutional. Still in 2013, the National Science Foundation concluded that media violence was one of the top 3 determinants of youth violence. But the industry was emboldened by the failure in California and for increasing demand for violent material. Games and TV have been studied and are found to be more violent than ever. President Obama introduced the VCR Act in 2013 to attempt to introduce some additional study and curb some violence in media in response to the Sandy Hook incident. But to summarize the studies that have been done so far, early investigation started not in the 1990s but in the 1950s. The causal relationship between exposure and real-world violence is well established. Media outlets, non-peer-reviewed journals consistently deny the validity of the results that have been established. The 2000 loss in the Supreme Court was rather devastating. It's interesting to read the opinions that are rendered in that and the different parties who weighed in. Violent content exposure and influence of all of that content is increasing at an alarming rate. And still the public is befuddled as to why we have problems with youth violence and youth engaging in mass shootings. So now we'll talk a little bit about children in violent media. That's usually where the focus should be, as children don't have a developed prefrontal cortex. We'll talk a little bit more about that. Their brains are still being established as to which direction they're going to go. And so it's important to consider them foremost in this discussion. So not all media violence is necessarily harmful. Harmful media violence is gratuitous or graphic, and it's intended to glamorize or shock the watcher. It's trivialized as humorous or fun. Powerful characters use it as a good problem-solving strategy and to dominate others. So children and adolescents are both the target of media violence as well as the problem. Harmful media violence is deliberately directed towards children. If you think back on your Disney films that you enjoyed as a child, the themes of revenge, murder and attempted murder, and other violent problem-solving strategies are throughout. G.I. Joe's, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, and then take a walk down the toy aisle. You can still do that today. The characters that, the violent characters that children get to watch on TV, they can take them home and then play with them all day. And then there's also a misleading video game rating system to confuse parents. Children are more, which we'll talk more about that, children are more susceptible to the harmful effects of violent media, which is why they're the problem. They get mean world syndrome, where when they see on the news or in television or video games terrible things happening to people, they think they're more at risk to bad things happening than they actually are. For instance, I guess I won't do a show of hands, but plus maybe probably a few people in here have never seen Jaws, but fearful images, fear of sharks, other things have been well studied, and phobias can last into adulthood. And a third of in a particular study, a third of those fears can be lifelong. So here's the video game rating system as it stands now. You have everyone, and then you have everyone 10 plus. That's a little confusing. Is it everyone or is it everyone 10 plus? They look mostly the same. And then mature. Who doesn't want to be mature, particularly when you're a teenager? The difference is 17 and 18. This is really reserved for titles that are pornographic. And the rest of the content, even if it includes nudity or graphic violence, goes into the mature category. So there's a minimal number of titles that ever go in to suggest that parents should be really cautious about having their children who don't have developed brains look at these titles. So this is nice. 50% of games get an E rating, 20% get that, so almost 60% have E, and only 30% have teen or mature. Contrast that with, in 2014, the top-selling video games. You have some sports games as 2, 7, and 9 of the top 10. You have some moderately violent games at 5, 6, and 8, depending on whether you use that sword or that axe in Minecraft. And then you have first-person shooters as 1, 3, and 10. And then, of course, the ultra-violent and heinous Grand Theft Auto is number 4. Fast forward to 2016, you have even more first-person shooters in the top 10 list. Now 5 of the top 10 are that, and Grand Theft Auto 5 has actually moved up to number 3. And the rest of these are violent. So of these titles, you have a total of 6 titles of the top 20 that are non-violent. Same here. These are definitely violent. The shooter and action and fighting games comprising over 50% of the top-selling things, but strategy, adventure, and role-playing games can also be violent. Purchasing is dramatically rising. In 2016, U.S. video game sales were $25 billion. 3 days after release, several years ago, Grand Theft Auto 5 sold $1 billion, compared to global record and song sales of $1.4 billion. Obviously, it's already outsold that by a lot. The Entertainment Merchants Association reports it's dedicated to advancing the interests of the $35 billion home entertainment industry. So they're not really invested in the success of parents or your children, but they would like to protect the profits of people who make these games. Here you see Grand Theft Auto sales compared to some other popular and profitable entities. I think there's some pretty good parallels between the video game industry and big tobacco back in the 50s. The Entertainment Merchants Association and the Entertainment Software Association represent the video game industry, and you have the tobacco industry. You have powerful lobbies that are wealthy, known health problems for children. public controversy, long-standing Surgeon General warnings, and medical consensus. And both of them promoted their products to adolescents. So here's an excerpt from a article back in the 60s talking about how erotic images in women's magazines and images of adventure, risk, and recreation in boys' magazines suggested that cigarettes were tailored to the implicit and explicit desires of teenagers so that they wouldn't be concerned about smoking. So here you have pinup for smoking, Lucky Strikes, and then you have the same for Grand Theft Auto 5. In looking at the same study, talking about how it was known for a long time that smoking was harmful, but nothing was done about it, it was extensively studied among surveys of high school students, focusing on why they were smoking and what could be done to increase awareness of that problem. So here's from the Entertainment Software Association. This is what they proudly put on their, the quote they proudly put on their website. A game is an opportunity to focus our energy with relentless optimism at something we're good at or getting better at and enjoy. In other words, gameplay is the direct emotional opposite of depression. That's probably not consistent with the experience of most pediatricians who evaluate children with video game addiction. Here's a study from the Kaiser Group. So from light users to heavy users, bad grades go way up. From light users to heavy users, boredom goes up, trouble goes up. And from moderate users to heavy users, sadness, which may or may not be a surrogate for depression, but certainly we know in screening tests that admitting that you are often sad or unhappy is certainly a problem, goes up as well. So I think that may contradict their opinion rendered on their website. From 2000 to 2009, we have an increase in children screen time to 49 hours a week, which I think is pretty impressive. 90% of movies and 60% of TV depict graphic violence. By 18 years, and this is old data, it's much higher now, children will have seen 40,000 simulated murder and 200,000 simulated acts of violence on television alone, which would be the equivalent of seeing every soldier who died from the United States in the Vietnam conflict killed over that same period of time. So it's important to know that children are not the same. They're not little adults. The way they think and view the world is not the same. This is well established and studied in parallel fields that are less controversial, and we can certainly apply that here. Children, as we know, learn by imitation. If you're a parent, you can see that readily in terms of the way they talk and the way they interact with their siblings and the things that they do that are just like what you do that may surprise you sometimes. It's difficult for them to distinguish fact for fiction. This is particularly important for small children, and they're not really able, with underdeveloped prefrontal cortices, they're not really able to distinguish between the good and bad of what they're doing. Someone must tell them what is good and what is bad, and they're certainly not getting that evaluative content in the media that they're watching. I think these social learning theory studies with the Bobo doll were very interesting. They took children and they would have them watch an adult yell at and beat up a Bobo doll in a room, and then the adult would leave the room and they would be observed through a one-way or two-way mirror. And so the children then, watching the adult do that, would proceed to yell at and punch and kick the Bobo doll. And this is how we can think of how children behave. Now that behavior may only stick for a few minutes in that particular instance, but if you saturate them with hours and hours of that over time, it has a long-term effect. It's critical to note that the frontal lobe, the conductor, the control of executive function, is not fully developed until about 24 years old. So even though we say mature, we don't really mean it. Of course, you all remember Pavlov's dogs and Skinner's rats from those classic experiments. Pavlov could get his dog to salivate to the sound of the bell. The rats would get their treat by clicking the lever. This is an advertisement pairing Doritos, Mountain Dew, and Call of Duty Advanced Warfare. You pair pleasure and killing together. So we're probably, as humans, we're less self-controlled than we think, and we have proof of that in several parallel areas. As far as obesity and bariatric surgery, we don't recommend anymore that people pull themselves up by the bootstraps. We know that in studied intervention, taking a population as a whole, that massive weight loss through diet and exercise is ultimately unsuccessful for the vast majority of persons. Same thing with depression. We don't recommend cognitive behavioral therapy alone, or just, pull yourself up by your bootstraps and feel better. We recommend combining that with antidepressants. And then, of course, we cannot ignore the $580 billion spent in 2014 on advertisements. If these weren't able to, in whatever way they work, get you to buy products of companies, then they would stop advertising. And, of course, we use simulation now for surgical training, laparoscopy, endoscopy, and we'll talk some more about other areas of simulation, too. So it's difficult to study this, and people come up with different ways that they can think about studying it, and you can't take any single study's findings into account. You have to look at studies as a group. This is one way that has been designed to promote further study, which has been effective. So here you have basically how a person interacts with others to either behave in aggressive ways and how that affects their personality over long term. So here you have a person who's in a conversation or something and the situation they're in at the time. This is what the roots are essentially what's going on in their brain, their emotional state, what they're thinking about, whether their heart rate's up or they're already upset about something. The outcomes are, how do they relate this conversation they're having or this interaction they're having with, how does that interact with how they are feeling at the time? And that plays into their decisions to make a thoughtful or impulsive action. And of course, then they do the action. It goes back to the social encounter that they were with in the first place and plays back into that. And so, using this general aggression model, it's been studied that violent media causes aggressive feelings, thoughts, behaviors, and physiologic arousal, leading to an aggressive personality. The lessons from violent media are pretty consistent, and if you watch television, you'll be able to find them, or watch popular movies, particularly ones that are sent towards teenagers, like Transformers. Heroes are violent and powerful, and the world is violent and dangerous. Killing is fun and rewarding. Women are inferior to men. Women are present for sexual gratification. Hostility to outsiders who are not like you is justified. Somewhat similar to probably some themes from Avengers and other comic book stories as well. So the lessons that children get from that is that people are not intrinsically valuable, and killing is fun and meaningless. So we kind of have a confusing standard that we've created for adolescents now. So sex is legal and perhaps even encouraged for adolescents in one way or another, but must not be digitally observed or simulated, i.e. pornography. However, violence is illegal and discouraged, but may be digitally observed and simulated as much as possible. So your mom probably had a theory on this: garbage in, garbage out. The effects of media violence, we've talked about some of these: increased aggression, fear, desensitization to real-world violence, increased appetite for violence, which we see by rising violent content. If it were just a tool of the storyteller, the violent content would remain constant. A violent story would be violent, a non-violent story would have no violence, but instead we see a uniform rise in overall violent content, including children's programming. It dehumanizes people, decreasing empathy, which is well studied, as well as increases racism and misogyny. So my dad told me video games make you stupid. I don't know. So I started out, this is a plumber, and you induce fatal cervical trauma by hopping on different characters throughout the game. And then there's the super scope. Anybody remember the super scope? No? Yeah. Getting old. And then Jungle Strike, where you're fighting terrorists in Iraq, essentially. Or no, that was Desert Strike. Jungle Strike was in the jungle, I guess. Street Fighter, GoldenEye, probably the first-person shooter that really brought first-person shooters to the forefront. Other things, these are games I played as a kid. And then when I got to college, got more into these first-person shooter games. There are 4 reasons that video games are more harmful than other forms of media violence. They're inherently satisfying, so they can supplant exercise. You don't have to You don't necessarily want to do other things when you're playing an enjoyable video game. They're designed to be addictive, so they can quickly change from just for fun to life dominating. One of the most important things is they're very effective at desensitization. So the unthinkable becomes thinkable. They're also incredible teachers and trainers. And when you're teaching bad equals good, the impossible, or what should have previously been impossible, becomes at least doable. Video game addiction is a real problem. There's 3 million child addicts in the US alone. We probably do better than some other countries in terms of video game addiction, but it's a real problem. Compared to 70,000 cases of pediatric appendicitis per year. So I did the math a while ago. I guess it's something like 43 cases of child addicts for every 1 case of appendicitis. It's an important problem. 90% play video games, 8.5% are pathologically addicted. So when people study addiction, they use cue reactivity as a paradigm to evaluate craving, what they're doing when they're thinking about a substance, food, or gambling. The desire and physiologic arousal can be measured when that cue comes, and for video games and substance abuse and other addictions, it's all the same. Functional MRI, EEG studies, and physiologic changes are observed. So desensitization from DSM-5, you have the antisocial personality disorder where you hurt for gain without remorse. And way back in DSM-3, you had the sadistic personality to hurt for pleasure. In violent video games, you get both. Killing is fun and meaningless. Have you ever paused to consider or ask a teenager, why do you want to play this game? Why is this fun? They're effective trainers. If we look at simulation in other industries, the fastest way to learn a language is Rosetta Stone. Just talking to one of our interpreters the other day, asked him what his background was, and he said he just picked up Rosetta Stone when he was a teenager or something and learned Spanish, and that was his way into that. Rocksmith is the fastest way to learn guitar. That's a video game you can play on Xbox or maybe PlayStation as well. It's the perfect teacher and killing simulator. They give you clear objectives in the game. You can dial it back so it's as easy or hard as you'd like it to be, and you get to practice a lot. And then they give you rewards, like in Grand Theft Auto. If you've been injured, you go have sex with a prostitute and you can get some of your health back. In Call of Duty, if you're really good at killing lots of other people, you'll get better guns than you had before, and you're rewarded with that to keep playing. And there's more and more rewards, and they don't really stop, so you just got to keep playing. And you move from mastery to overlearning so that the skill set that you've acquired in that game will be readily transferable to the next. Have you guys seen these yet? So I have never used these before, but this is these are virtual reality guns. This is one that you can put on your phone. So if you don't think they're good at training people to kill other people now, they probably will be soon. But I don't know who's going to pony up $680 right now, but the price will come down. So what does it take to kill another person? The author of one of the books I talk about, Stop Teaching Our Kids to Kill, is also the foremost author and person in the United States probably on the psychology of killing. And he says it takes 3 things: a gun or a weapon, surrogate for a weapon if there's no guns available, the skill to do it, and the will. So video games help provide the skill and the will for this, and the gun or weapon comes from somewhere else. But in terms of training, very effective, and then also the will, decreased empathy among peers, increased overall aggression. It certainly doesn't supply, by no means does it supply every piece to that. There's a lot that goes into someone who becomes hopeless and a rampage shooter that has nothing to do with their video games. But nonetheless, it's a key piece of that puzzle in that area. Police use simulators to train. And their simulators, they would be punished for killing a civilian, things like that. We've seen them in the movies, either the real simulators where things pop up, or now they probably can do it much cheaper using video game simulation. The difference is adults are doing police training. They have more established prefrontal cortex, and they have discipline and authority. Compared to children who are much younger, they have connections that are developing between their limbic system and prefrontal cortex, and there's no supervision and no feedback to say what you're doing is okay. To illustrate from from World War II to Vietnam, in World War II, people were trained with a target, and then they switched to a silhouette in Vietnam. firing rate increased from 15 to 95%, less than 15%, I guess. Now we're using computer simulators so that police and soldiers can train until killing is natural. You want to reduce thinking on the battlefield so that if you're effectively desensitized to what you're doing, so all you can do is evaluate whether that is in fact your objective. If you're on an airplane, if you're in surgery, if you're on the battlefield and you're doing excessive amount of thinking rather than doing, there's a potential for a lot of people to get hurt. So let's go back to that individual who feels hopeless under some very heavy circumstances. Let's give that individual a bomb. Let's extinguish their homicide inhibition, which is otherwise natural. Let's desensitize them to the sights and sounds of killing, and then let's give them improved killing strategy, which we see all of these exhibited in real events. So there's a lot of criticism of what I've told you so far, and this is a hotly debated topic, and we'll talk about some of the reasons why and perhaps some answers for what people think. In our study of 2012, sometimes pre-existing beliefs will trump evidence, and I think we find that a lot of times when you read what people blog about this. What I had a dear friend write that or he regularly posts things on Facebook about how media violence has nothing to do with anyone's real violent behavior or anything like that, and he just says it with conviction, and I assume some people believe that he knows what he's talking about. This is the classic joke about that, is gaming and winning, no violence, gaming and losing, violence. So they're just making kind of making light of the situation. The most frequent criticisms I probably hear is one is I turned out okay. That's probably the most popular. It's really about guns. This is just a distraction. Other countries play video games and they don't have this problem. There is no problem. There is no relationship. So in terms of I turned out okay, well, good for you. I played a lot of video games. I played video games excessively. I turned out okay too. Good for all of us. Seat belts, car seats, bicycle helmets, smoking. Population-wise, if you don't do any of these things, you're probably more, even if you smoke, never wore a seatbelt or a car seat, and never wore a bicycle helmet, you're probably more likely to make it to adulthood than not. It's much more likely if you smoke that you will not get lung cancer than you will get lung cancer, but we still know the harmful effects of these things, and so as a population we've decided they're important to reduce the number of people who will be affected by doing those unsafe things. So I don't want to get into, I don't think these are mutually exclusive, I'll mention that as well, but people like to discuss guns and then move on from the discussion about media violence, which I probably think is not appropriate. So in terms of statistics that you'll see on various news outlets, typically the reported statistic is gun death versus homicide. The United States clearly has many more guns than other countries, and gun death is higher compared to homicide, and my assertion is that this is at least in part a global problem. Homicide, on the other hand, is United States is much farther down on the list for homicide compared to gun death. Then also people will talk about the number of guns compared to household ownership. Household ownership is probably a more appropriate measure of who has access to guns, because some people will have multiple access to guns, and that doesn't mean that even though someone might use multiple guns in an event, it doesn't mean that they don't have it doesn't mean that the number of people who don't have any in their household that they're available to them. And then, of course, we have international incidents of these things. It's controversial. There's only a few studies looking at how frequent they are, and they study news outlets, etc. Do you count terrorism? Do you not count terrorism? Is that a different brand of things that are occurring outside of the United States? I certainly think it's important, and some of the studies that are done would suggest that the global intake of media violence has led to a globally violent culture with Arnold Schwarzenegger previously and other U.S. action stars, and now video game avatars are heroes internationally. And then, of course, mass killings in China can be done by other means, knives and other what they call melee weapons as well. So, but my biggest thing is really that this is probably not relevant to the discussion, is that if you are on either side of a debate about guns, you can come together around the fact that media violence is harmful for children. So if you're hardcore, you don't want anyone to have a semi-automatic weapon, or you don't want people to have any guns unless they've proven that they can have one, like other countries or something like that, or you are in favor of having multiple guns and very pro Second Amendment rights. There's no reason we can't agree on this topic. So in terms of a parallel from medicine, so when someone is getting a disease, your previous state plus the new variable equals your disease and symptoms, right, unless they're masked. So the pre-existent state did not cause your disease. Of course, symptoms can be masked. So if you can follow what I'm saying, modifying variables of a previous state, something that didn't really have to do with the acquisition of your disease, like diabetes, may potentially help your disease process. But it's likely it's inferior to something that actually treats the problem that you have. So treating a symptom versus treating the disease itself is what I'm talking about. So in the United States, mental health problems, easy access to semi-automatic weapons, socioeconomic disparities seem to be, at this point, a reasonably stable part of the United States for decades prior to the epidemic of rampage shooting, although some of those variables are moving as well. A new variable that at least seems to contribute to this would be media violence, which is essentially a novelty from the 50s on, and making comparisons to content in books and fairy tales is probably not appropriate given the amount of time that is spent on media today compared to the amount of time you would have at story time at bedtime with a violent Hansel and Gretel story. Other countries play video games, they don't have this problem. Well, one, that's not true. They do have this problem. The debate is how frequently other countries have this problem compared to the United States, and depending on which source you look at, you'll have a different answer. First person, but Asian countries are typically brought up because the stereotype would be that in Asian countries play more video games than the United States and are peaceful. However, first-person shooter, but the cross-sectional data there lump the sales of video game things in those countries compared to the United States. But specifically, first-person shooter games and war games are not popular in Asian countries. One Sega executive noted, only countries that won World War II play war-based video games. They don't even, most production companies don't even make those. Those are more a function of the United States. So the influence of violent media is going to be different depending on which cultural context you're in. I'm most familiar with the cultural context in the United States, so that's what I can best speak to. Addiction is obviously a huge problem in the United States, but as far as I can tell, it's an even bigger problem in Korea and some other Asian countries where they actually have like help clinics and things like that for video game addiction. And then another thing that you'll hear is there is no problem, no relationship. This is a moral panic, fear-mongering. Research is lacking, crime is down. So to these people, I would say, does rare and rising equal unimportant? Is violent crime rate really down? Obviously, we have huge advances in medical technology, that people who would previously have succumbed to their injuries are now surviving, decreasing the amount of homicide. We have the highest imprisonment rate in the world, and then there's also underreporting of problems as well. So this, you'll see a lot of pictures kind of like this on the internet, but you'll never see one like this. And I don't mean this to cause a disparity between people who are pro and against guns, but the point is that there's been a relatively stable, maybe slightly decreasing number of households with guns in the United States since 2000. And before that as well, but I'm just using numbers that I have that I can compare all at the same time. Compared to U.S. video game sales, which, as we know, are predominantly violent and first-person shooters, and mass shootings, which are all going up. So remember this slide when you look at it. When you go do research on your own, you'll see slides that look exactly opposite. Think about the variables that they're retrieving for you and they're putting on their slide to come to the conclusion that media violence has no relationship with real-world behavior. We talked about the advances in medical technology. In schools, we have metal detectors, police. Why do we need police in schools in the first place? It seems a stupid question now, but you think back years ago, why should you need police to have children hang out together with their teachers? It's dumb, right? It's not dumb now. and then zero tolerance policies for violence, which may actually make things worse. I scribbled this together last night. I put my name on it so you'd know my 7-year-old didn't make it. So my wife didn't get it when I explained it to her, so I'll see if I can quickly explain it to you. Society has to do something when you have violence, right? If everyone who played a violent video game or took in violent media became a mass shooter or a violent criminal, society would immediately break down. There has to be a response if there is a relationship. And so, of course, we've made responses. There's been some element of denial, but we've increased imprisonment. We've increased police presence in schools. We have the zero tolerance policy to violence. So things come out anyway, and they come out in ways that are not easy to deter or detect. And so terrorism sometimes slips out. Suicide is very difficult to detect. Bullying is also hard to stop because that happens when no one's looking. And the same is true for mass shootings. They don't typically tell. They do let some people know, but in terms of definitive plans or having someone come along with them and having a teammate in their mass shootings, that's not very common. So in terms of conclusion and call to action, there's in Stop Teaching Our Kids to Kill, which I would recommend. It's readable for children as well. They have 4 Ps that they discuss. One is this is a process. So if you have kids, this is an intervention that takes time. And so since it takes time to develop all these negative scripts that result in these problems, it also takes time to talk about it and to work with it. You need to give your children and talk to others about giving their children a framework of how to interpret what they're looking at. You're not going to be able to prevent the intake of violent media by your children, but give them an idea of how to think about it. Also, you should empower them to know that they're in charge of the off switch. They don't have to look at things they don't want to. They can change the channel. Giving that will help break cycles of addiction. And then also, keep things in perspective. If they see something you don't want them to see or things like that, you need to not overreact and communicate, because otherwise you'll shut things down, and you want those communication lines open. So my hope is on that next Hartford consensus where they concluded that tourniquets will save lives, but these things are going to keep happening and there's nothing we can do. My hope is that maybe there's something we can do, and that on the next Hartford consensus by the trauma folks and surgery folks will have something about this in there. We passed a resolution at the TMA to include warning labels for violent games and a SMART curriculum, which is essentially a media reduction strategy for the state, which would probably cost about $200,000 to implement statewide, which would really probably be very doable. This is a pet peeve of mine. The names of these perpetrators should be forgotten. They should never be spoken after that. People who kill defenseless children should not be famous. That's part of their goal in this. They certainly should be pitied, and some people would say, disagree with that, but I think they should be pitied, but they're certainly not heroes. This is the resolution, both pages of it. There's too much to talk about here on that, but basically it's the video games and the media reduction and associated violent content reduction for schools. And then this would be an example label. Probably some wording needs to be redone that would be required by manufacturers to put it on their guns. And since it says, like California does, known by the state of Tennessee, there's no problem with free speech violations, etc. And so hopefully that would have a chance to go through, since we need some other routes. So in conclusion, child minds are not developed to process violent media appropriately. Exposure leads to violent cognition and ultimately behavior in some at-risk individuals. Video games are probably more dangerous than other media due to training, addiction, and desensitization in particular. Decreasing exposure in our children as a whole will decrease violence in at-risk individuals and greater society over time, though it may take quite a while to see some of those benefits, but certainly starting in your own community can make a difference very early on. Hill, who wrote the criteria for causality, said all scientific work is incomplete, and even though we don't know everything, that doesn't give us the freedom to ignore the knowledge we already have or postpone the necessary action that it appears to demand at a given time. And I think this demands action. I think you have a debate that media violence is not harmful versus it is harmful. I think it is dramatically outweighed on the harmful side compared to the not harmful side. One of the biggest things besides the overwhelming scientific studies is also logic. it makes sense that this would be what you would find, and it is. So the burden of proof would be on folks over here to prove definitively that it doesn't, because everything about that we know about childhood development and education would say that this would be a problem. Thank you to my wife who puts up with me doing all of this research. She's watching our rascals. And I'll take questions if there's time.
We have questions or comments for Caleb? Caleb, go back to the point about, I'm not sure that I understood completely your point about numbers of guns in the household guns versus numbers of guns. What's
Sure.
the, I mean,
So
make
in the
point.
United States, people typically will own, gun owners will typically own multiple guns. So compared to a unit of one for a household who owns guns. So you can make the statistics can lie, you can make them say whatever you want, but probably a more realistic representation of who has access to guns, which to me seems to be the real question, would be households with a gun compared to numbers of guns. Because if you have someone who has 30 guns and they're a responsible citizen, that makes the, whatever that is, the denominator, inappropriately large.
Okay, all right, okay. Well, any questions or comments? I would have to say one point you made was about about lifelong concerns, having seen things that are violent. I have never, nor will I ever forgive my wife for dragging me to see Jaws.
That's true.
Because I really enjoyed swimming in the ocean until I saw Jaws.
Yeah.
And now I'd stay in the shallow water and still keep an eye
Anyone
out
else,
for what
Jaws
may
specifically?
happen. So I mean, there are personal things that you can relate to. So that related
Jaws
to me.
is the Jaws is the classic one.
Okay, Heath, you have a.
Caleb, that was fantastic. Once again, specifically, have you seen anything new research or whatever is coming out about the VR, about specifically how it's changing? Is it worse? Is it the same? Is it?
You would think that in a lot of ways that it would be the same in terms of exposure. The difference that I would anticipate that you'll see is you would have improved training. That would be the number one thing, and so. So regardless of whether you're a citizen who acts on these things, you will be effectively trained and effectively desensitized. So what I always say as an example is in the John Wayne movie where, he's like, son, you don't have you're not going to shoot me, give me that gun. I wouldn't do that today because the children that have committed however many murders on their video game do not have any inhibition, even if they don't really want to. Like the 9-year-old, he knows what killing means. He knows what being dead means, right? So the 9-year-old who shot his sister over his video game controller, note that the video game remains nameless that they were fighting over. It doesn't really matter, but statistically speaking, it was probably violent. And by the way that he acted, he was trained already in video game violence. And so in the same way, virtual reality with guns that you can hold will improve training and ability for people to pull the trigger when they want to. We have extraordinary societal interventions to prevent all of, and myself and the young people in the room who grew up playing these video games from acting on that skill that they have, because we know that that's inappropriate, but nonetheless, it's still there.
Yes, Woody.
Once again, very good bringing this to life. I guess that one thing I think that I sort of wish you'd sort of got on a little bit is the lack of parental guidance in this whole scheme, because I think as far as when probably most of us in here, our parents were around, our parents supported us, they encouraged us to do better, and you learned a lot of responsibilities early on, at least I did, and I suspect most people in here did. I think some of the problem is the parents will buy this game. They don't just, these games are not cheap. They're $50 a pop. And so somebody's,
$70, and you have to buy more.
And an 8-year-old, someone's buying that 8-year-old, that 9-year-old that game. And so for the parents to do this, it shows a lack of their education and the lack of their interest in their children to just turn them loose with this. You can take some of the best things that we have, and if without the proper guidance, can really turn into something bad. These are great educational tools, but they're teaching the wrong thing.
Right.
So, for that, I think that it's really important that if you really look at the parental side of this, I think the parents probably have most of the blame for this.
Yeah.
And this going forward and the propagation of this right now.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And what you'll read in research on this, I think, especially with how saturated, it's getting increasingly difficult to study this topic with 90% of children playing video games and 98% household TV ownership. When things are saturated, how are you going to compare two different groups who already have scripts that they know what to do with the content that a researcher is putting in front of someone? So I think you'll find, which is the trend that I'm seeing, that the research is getting softer and softer in its conclusion, and people who are saying that there is no harm are getting bolder about that because you have a societal saturation point which has occurred initially for television and movie violence and subsequently for video game violence.
Both of neither one of my two girls, one being girls, were not that interested in this, but they, we were very protective over what they could get and do. It was my money, and we're buying it for them. Everything they got were pretty much educational, and now they're both, card-carrying members for the NRA and have concealed weapon permits, but they've done it in the right way. So it's all. I still think a lot of this is very multifactorial and has a lot to do with the parental upbringing.
Right.
I would point out the thing that I thought this. First of all, it's a brilliant topic, and you've researched it. But the thing I thought was so significant a year ago when Caleb did this is that this is a very scholarly approach to a problem. I mean, he's willing to listen to the other side and even tell you what their argument is. And, he sort of debates with himself with this, and I really appreciate that in the presentation. For those of you that might have missed it, a lot of younger people don't subscribe to a newspaper, but he did an op-ed piece that was the lead story in the Times on Sunday about this. And it's very, very well done. And I think that to your point, Woody, the more we as physicians and people that are interested in behavior and caring for people let people know that this is something that you ought to be aware of. This is a problem, and then because I know in my grandchildren, I did the same thing you're talking about, but their parents are also doing the same thing to try to avoid at least this. The addiction is hard to get away from because they can get addicted to a nonviolent game. But you can at least help try to control what they're watching, at least it seems to me.
Yeah.
Great job again, man. We're going to miss you here in Chattanooga. We've got to break because our time's up. Thanks again very much.